Hey guys, tonight we're going to step into the magnificent Palace of Versailles just to unveil the 5 worst hygiene habits of royal women, from bathing with vinegar-soaked cloths to such a lack of proper toilets that they used windows as restrooms, to wearing greasy wigs teeming with lice, to kitchens polluted with waste, and even childbirth staged like a public theatre. Each habit was so horrific: stench, disease, and parasites ran rampant that even the court's own guests were horrified. You won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your area. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine you step through the massive gates of the Château de Versailles, about 20 kilometers from Paris, France, and immediately feel the 17th century atmosphere closing in around you. Before you stretches a vast hall lined with gleaming Corinthian columns, extending as far as the eye can see beneath a soaring Baroque ceiling. Intricate frescoes cover every inch of the vault, while dozens of crystal chandeliers twinkle like stars in the night sky. You might think you've entered a palace of the gods, where every stone and every mirror testifies to unmatched power and artistry. But when you take a deep breath expecting the scent of roses or precious essential oils, your nostrils instead recoil at a foul, overwhelming stench. It's not floral at all, but a blend of servants' sweat, animal fats from the royal kitchens, vinegar residue still clinging to damp cloths, and even the odor of pets and horses fouling the rear courtyards. You realize that, no matter how lavish the surroundings, if basic cleanliness is abandoned, all the gilded splendor is just a mask for a hygiene nightmare. Your eyes drift down to the thick Persian carpets underfoot, once soft and luxurious, now more akin to filthy bedding, scattered pastry crumbs, shed, animal hair, leftover scraps of food, and even traces of animal droppings. Each step you take sends a hush of dust and debris swirling from the tangled fibers. The contrast between the polished marble floors elsewhere and these filthy rugs is nothing short of jarring. Even nobles from the east and the far north of Europe, upon first arriving at Versailles, shuddered in shock. They had heard of Europe's most opulent court, but what struck them more deeply was the rank odor rising whenever the velvet drapes swayed. You can't help but wonder how these illustrious families could tolerate such squalor so proud, yet crawling with germs. In 17th century Versailles, personal bathing was nearly unheard of. Physicians warned that warm water would open the pores and invite disease, while the church denounced baths as dens of temptation. You, as a royal lady, would have been allowed only to wipe yourself with a cloth soaked in vinegar or spirit, a method they praised as refined and elegant, though in truth it just left a sticky residue that itched for days. When you picture a proper bath, you imagine a wooden tub shared by the entire household, men first, filling it with sweat, soap scum, and assorted detritus, leaving the water cold, murky, and foul-smelling by your turn. You wonder whether you'd ever dare immerse yourself again. Toilet hygiene was equally nightmarish. Versailles boasted almost no fixed privies. Instead, you relied on a portable chamber pot that someone would hurl out the window the moment you finished. You can picture grand rooms turning into open-air latrines, with every gust of breeze carrying a new wave of filth into your elegant handkerchief. And when you finally tried to wash your hands, proper toilet paper or running water was a luxury. You'd grab a scrap of cloth, a dry leaf, or worst of all, rub your unwashed hands directly, perpetuating a cycle of bacteria with no end in sight. You shudder at the thought of germs and parasites clinging to every pore, waiting to invade through the slightest cut or abrasion. The royal kitchens offered no reprieve. Picture a vast cooking hall with roaring ovens and rows of pots and pans, But beneath it runs a decrepit sewer system where rotting refuse and wastewater sometimes backflow into the very pots from which you eat. That image alone leaves you reeling, cooks ladling out soup and carving meat, oblivious to the threat of poisoning. As you press on, you understand that Versailles was not merely a royal residence, but also a breeding ground for bacteria, parasites, and disease. Every tile, every layer of gold leaf might hide a deadly hazard. And you, the distant observer, are about to witness the 5 worst hygiene habits of royal women, proof that the most dazzling facade can conceal the ugliest filth. Imagine yourself as a noblewoman in 17th century Paris, expected to be flawless in every way. Your royal blue velvet gown without a single crease. Your pure white gloves as smooth as snow. Your lashes perfectly curled. And your every gesture exuding effortless grace. Every step you take is a statement of status, elegance, and charm. They call you the embodiment of pure beauty, and all eyes turn to you when you enter the ballroom. Yet there is one thing few dare mention or prefer to ignore, that behind this image lies an absurd rejection of frequent bathing. Did you know that? In the medical thinking of the time, warm water wasn't a remedy, but an enemy of the body. Physicians believed that when you soaked in water, your pores would open wide like doors, inviting in all manner of germs and disease from outside. A renowned court doctor once advised noble women, "Just a light wiping will do. Don't let that delicate skin be assaulted by water. If you were truly as precious as they praised, of course you would never harm yourself by thoroughly washing." And it didn't end there. The power of the church pushed women even further from bathhouses. Clerics preached that tubs were dens of temptation, where lust and vanity reigned. A prioress declared that any woman who indulged in a steam bath committed a sin. She was flaunting her body before men. So, even if the palace boasted a gilded bathtub, you wouldn't dare set foot in it, fearing whispers of worldliness or the disapproving glare of the clergy. Instead of bathing, you and the other noble women were permitted only to wipe your face, neck, and hands with a damp cloth. But it wasn't a cloth dipped fully in water and wrung out. Yours was soaked in vinegar, spirits, or even spit, so as to preserve refinement without letting your skin touch an abundance of water. You took that small cloth, gently glided it across your forehead, swept it over your nostrils and lips, then wiped your neck and the back of your hands. Every movement was silent, performed discreetly to avoid noise or spectacle. You felt the cloth tug slightly at your skin. The faint tang of vinegar mixed with alcohol tingled your nostrils. At first, you thought it was clean, elegant, as they liked to say. But the truth was that each damp cloth harbored countless bacteria and mold from previous uses. You kept reusing the same cloth for days, perhaps the entire week, because laundering too often was deemed immoral. Were you then inviting germs into your flesh day after day? This luxurious cleansing ritual unwittingly created a film of grime skin's natural oils, sweat, dead cells, and deposited vinegar residue growing thicker each day. Gradually, your skin felt rough, itchy, and your pores clogged with debris, getting worse by the hour. You hinted to the court secretary, "This damp cloth irritates me." But naturally, you dared not defy the royal bathing ban. You realized that this refined hygiene was not only ineffective but counterproductive. What began as a faint bodily scent turned into a persistent, musty odor and a greasy, stale, vinegary stench. If someone brushed against your shoulder, they would recoil at the sticky feel, breathing in that lingering vinegar note. You wondered, if they could see that crust of filth, would they still hail you as the pinnacle of elegance? Within the majestic walls of Versailles, the fear of overbathing and the pressure to maintain a perfect image cost you your health. Many noblewomen later recounted agonizing itchiness, even secondary skin infections. Yet they remained silent, complaining openly, risked being labelled weak or depraved. Id. If you were born into that court, you'd learn to conceal every bodily sign. You'd layer on thick, leady-based makeup, remove it with oil, wipe lightly with your vinegar cloth, then reapply makeup before appearing in public. All this to hide the traces left by the bizarre hygiene routine and ensure everyone saw you radiant, despite your skin secretly enduring a battalion of bacterial bombs. Id. Thus, in 17th century French society, frequent bathing was a sin, while wiping with a vinegar-damp cloth became a symbol of high status. You, as a modern observer, might marvel that behind all that glitter lay a civilization that shunned water. But that is precisely why we must delve deeper. When you peer into those vinegar-soaked cloths and the layers of grime they conceal, you will understand why the next 5 hygiene habits are so horrifying. When the need for a full body wash at an ordinary frequency was deemed superfluous, soaking in the tub became an extraordinarily special and communal event. Imagine, in the most splendid palace in France, there was only a single large wooden tub placed ceremoniously in a marbly floored room. Every noble member of the royal family had to share it, and each soak meant waiting in a patient but far from comfortable queue. This was the 3rd disastrous hygiene practice that you, a royal lady, were forced to endure. This tub, typically made of high-quality oak, it was outfitted with rudimentary piping hot water, had to be drawn from the nearby hearth and stirred until it cooled slightly before being poured into the tub. At first, you might feel a pleasant warmth when your feet touched the water, but the fun quickly ended when you realized it was far from the first time that water had received countless other bodies. Noblemen or royal household members considered more important went in first, soaking the longest to assert their status. By the time it was your turn, the water had grown cold, murky, and thick with residuary mixture of clotted soap, sweat, and lift our dead skin cells. You stepped into the tub, trying to duck in and out quickly so as not to waste too much time. Yet the moment your foot touched the water, chunks of dried soap foam broke apart and floated around your calphosite, both disgusting and heartbreaking. When you swept your hand across the surface, wisps of fine hair and a few strands of fallen hair clung to your fingers, reminders that those who soaked before you had left their mark. The water gave off a stale odor mixed with a metallic tang from the long unreplaced oak, making you shiver even in that brief moment. The filthy water's condition not only caused immediate discomfort, but also harbored a multitude of pathogens. You had heard that many ducal and marquis families became victims of dermatitis, breaking out in blisters and suffering such intense itching they had to wrap their limbs in linen to avoid slipping out of their shoes. A famed Madame Duplat had to hide in her private chambers for a week because the fungus between her fingers caused her to bleed whenever she touched any piece of jewellery. Meanwhile, the Beaumont family passed among themselves a tale of every member suffering folliculitis, peeling like fish scales, all because of one single use of the same unclean tub. It is even more terrifying to know that cleaning the tub thoroughly was never a priority. They gave reasons such as bathing too often is decadence, or feared rumours that the royal family was living in excess. King Louis XIV once declared, "Maintaining royal tradition does not permit the nobility to compete in bathing," as proof of power and pride, and so the dirty water was used again and again. Layering filthy seasonings meant only for those brave enough to step into the tub. The stench from the bathroom quickly spread throughout the palace. You could smell animal fat from the kitchen next door, the tang of vinegar still clinging to the wiping cloths, and the fragrant powder that courtiers used to mask body odour. This ominous blend clung to every nook: velvet drapes, tabletops, banisters. Many guests, upon leaving the bathroom, complained of headaches and nausea, requiring palace servants to shield them with feather fans to blunt the smell. The servants, their senses long desensitized, still tried fanning the air to dispel that chaotic scent. But their efforts were no more effective than applying a thin layer of perfume over an oil stain. At times, eunuchs had to place charcoal briquettes in the bathroom corners to absorb some of the odor. But it helped only marginally. Some maids whispered that after every grand ball, the bathroom had to be disinfected with quicklime, painful, brutal measure that was never repeated often for fear of breaching royal etiquette. When you stepped out of the tub, a servant hurriedly handed you a soft velvet towel to dry off. But that very towel, unless thoroughly washed, was soaked with bacteria from its previous use. You tried to pat yourself dry swiftly, slipped into your silk gown and jewel-encrusted adornments, concealing every trace of your special soak. Your skin, once lauded as smooth, now tingled with a slight sting as though 1,000 tiny needles were pricking your body. Many noble women recounted that after each bath, they had to slather on a thick layer of fragrant oil, hoping to mask the stench. But the perfume oil only made their skin feel stickier, brazenly nurturing, an environment in which bacteria and mold could thrive. You wondered if there were any real solutions to improve this predicament, or if it was all just the horrifying secrets of a bygone golden era. Yet, for royal women, enduring this experience brought no benefits beyond reputation. You, as a modern observer, might be surprised to learn that the tub was not a place of relaxation but a hothouse for all manner of pathogens. And that is precisely why we call this communal soaking habit the third hygiene disaster. A horrifying combination of power, pride, and the price paid for a dazzling exterior. This method of cleansing, seemingly water-saving and dignity-preserving, in fact created endless colonies of parasites, mold, and bacteria. You, if you lived in that era, would have to learn to shed the glamorous cloak to face reality. Those tubs not only threatened the skin, but also endangered health and life. And when you gazed at your reflection in that murky water, you would understand that sometimes the height of luxury is the very source of the worst disaster. When you think that the lack of toilets is merely a small detail at most, a minor inconvenience at Versailles in the 17th century, it becomes an unimaginable sanitation nightmare. The Palace of Versailles sprawled across hundreds of rooms, hosting thousands of visitors each month. Yet it had virtually no fixed toilets. Instead of gleaming tiled lavatories, you and the other nobles had only chamber pot-sportable porcelain or metal, bowl stuck behind curtains or in room corners. Whenever nature called, you had to find a secluded spot, draw back the drape, and take care of business. The space was the height of luxury, but you still felt like the star of a grimy theatre of foul odours. That chamber pot, at first glance small and unassuming, held all your hidden secrets. You would hide behind a velvet drape, your mind racing with fear that someone might accidentally brush it aside while you were occupied. You heard the sound of trickling water from a supposed drain pipe, but it was only a ruse. There had never been any sewage piping there. When you finished, you had to stand up, heft the heavy pot to the window, quietly crack it open, and then toss it out. Under the pale moonlight, you heard the pot clatter onto the gravel courtyard below, mingled with the startled chirps of any nearby birds. You shuddered as you realized that waste banquet was raining down somewhere, splattering across the stone and pooling in the corners in stains that could not be scrubbed away. This did not happen only under cover of darkness. By day, you could catch sight of nobles strolling along as you heard the clink of chamber pots being set down on the marble floors of the grand hall or corridors. Hidden alcoves behind Corinthian columns served as convenient restrooms. Sometimes, guests whispered about seeing traces of excrement on the marble black smears or splatters in the grout. You wondered whether those foreign dignitaries could endure such a spectacle. Indeed, many international visitors could not hold back their complaints. They described Versailles as a necropolis reeking of human filth. where the dazzling architecture could not conceal the monstrous stench. An Italian ambassador once wrote in his journal that he must hold his breath while passing through the corridors, just hoping to get beyond those columns. An English merchant compared the palace's hallway odour to a public midden. Hearing such remarks, you felt ashamed for the monarchy ruling over Europe, yet unable to provide its people with proper lavatories. By 1715, Louis XIV, all-powerful Sunday king, was forced to decree that corridors be cleaned once a week. This was hailed as the greatest sanitary reform to date. But what do you think? Cleaning only once a week? The waste of hundreds, even thousands, of people merely swept up and rinsed away in a single wash? Reading that directive, you could only sigh, by modern standards. This measure was worse than doing nothing, even though they cleaned. 1 C's week service could not stem the human waste odour, the germs, the rodents, the flies, and every lurking pestilence. The consequence of such perfunctory cleaning was endless disease outbreaks. You heard that many guests suffered gastrointestinal distress, acute diarrhea, then enteritis, with some bedridden. A few royal physicians proposed doubling the cleaning frequency to twice a week, but were dismissed for wasting the royal treasury and losing face. You felt the absurdity keenly. The monarchy would burn gold to cast statues, drape halls in velvet, yet dared not spend a few coins to build proper toilets. You were even more horrified to learn that during grand festivities, when the palace hosted thousands, the corridor cleaning was postponed to prioritize the banquet hall and VIP sleeping quarters. The hallways reeked like cesspits, and you had to tiptoe over pools of blackened filth, praying not to step in it. You wore thin gloves to handle the banister, yet the gloves still collected grit, making you shudder. Such sights made you understand why the chamber pot a shameful, embarrassing object became indispensable. Nobles used only chamber pots and refused to have fixed seats installed, deeming permanence vulgar and unscientific. You heard of a self-taught architect once invited to design hidden lavatories, but being snubbed as unsuitable for the Baroque style. You laughed bitterly. If gilded halls could channel waste everywhere, yet a dignified restroom was considered decadent. That experience haunted you every time you wandered the palace. You blinked at the marble walls, believing they narrated a glorious history, when in truth they concealed a sanitation tragedy. The stench from the bathing chambers, the human waste in the corridors, mingling with the perfume dust cast on clothes, made you feel trapped in a maze of foul odour. You tried closing your eyes and inhaling deeply to calm yourself. But seconds later, the stink washed over you again in waves. Finally, you asked yourself, might there ever come a day when the shame of sanitation ceased to be so great, and the monarchy dared to build a few proper toilets? Or would you, though titled a royal lady, still have to live alongside the disaster of chamber pots, facing stench and disease every day? After all, this was the 4th hygiene catastrophe in the horrifying series that royal women of the 17th century had to endure. The horror of lacking a proper seat. As you turned away, leaving those guilty chamber pots behind, you realized that in that world of opulence, sometimes the obvious was the most precious thing of Alland, the most denied. When you step away from the hidden corner behind the drape, thinking you've completed the task, the cleansing that follows is nothing more than a perfunctory gesture. You have no modern toilet paper, nor any running water to flush away every trace. Instead, you revert to scraps of cloth reused repeatedly, dry leaves hastily picked from the garden, dill dump straw, or worst of all, the very hands that have never been properly washed. As you use these makeshift materials to wipe yourself, the sticky, abrasive sensation immediately registers on your skin, accompanied by a faint waft of sweat mixed with human waste that makes you shudder. This brutal method direct rubbing turns your delicate, sensitive skin into a breeding ground for bacteria. mold, and parasites. After only a few rounds of cleaning with ragged cloths and leaves, your skin begins to betray horrifying signs. Tiny red welts, minute blisters, followed by peeling, itching patches that sometimes ooze, skin conditions such as folliculitis, contact dermatitis, and athlete's foot become common occurrences, not only undermining your confidence, but also posing serious infection risks. Even genital infections and urinary tract infections sweep through the court, trapping countless noble women in a spiral of pain, each sharp sting a reminder every time they finish up or move about. Moreover, the heavy, layered gowns and tight corsets that you adorn inadvertently lock moisture and grime close to your skin. You might think the satin and silk layers simply signify status, but in reality, they form a sealed, humid cage where heat from your body gets trapped, fostering the proliferation of microbes and fungi. You wear at least 3 or 4 layers of fabric silk linings, cotton undergarments, then the outer finery. Sweat cannot evaporate, leaving your lower abdomen, inner thighs, and wrists perpetually damp, ideal conditions for parasites to thrive. Each time you clean up afterward, you must maintain a composed, graceful demeanor, as if nothing had happened. Even though your skin burns and itches, you are required to offer a slight, serene smile when appearing before the court or distinguished guests. Losing face is the ultimate taboo. You may not complain or express discomfort, for any such admission would be branded as weak or depraved in an instant. Thus, even as pain cuts like a knife, you press your lips together, adjust your gown, and give a slight curtsy, concealing all your suffering beneath layers of opulent fabric. There are days when you must attach a scented sachet at your hip, hoping the rose and camphor fragrance will mask the musty odor. Yet the heavy perfume only suffocates you further when its chemical scent mingles with the stench of filth. Thickening the air around you, you know these sachets are stuffed with orange peels, dried flowers, and cinnamon bark. But even frantic changes throughout the day cannot stave off the wave of nausea that washes over you whenever that rancid scent surges. Many noble women recount that they resorted to drinking licorice tea or herbal infusions to soothe the itching, or had herbal poultices applied to their skin. However, these botanical remedies only provided temporary relief, unable to cure the persistent dampness fostered by layered gowns. You once asked the royal physician for a prescription ointment, only to hide the jar beneath your bodice, fearful of being accused of over-treatment and lack of endurance. The worst of all, of course, is the intimate area. You have no modern underwear, only a single pair of silk underdrawers changed, rarely, perhaps weekly. You know that despite its fine tailoring, this undergarment harbors filth from the crude wiping methods. As you move, the lining rubs against sensitive skin, causing sores, itching, and even some women ended up hospitalized with severe vaginal inflammation, jolting awake from their slumber at night in burning agony. You wonder, will there ever be a day when you can venture into town to buy a few sheets of soft paper? Or will you be doomed to reuse those tattered rags forever? This helplessness forces you to stare into the mirror, pondering whether that gown embroidered in gold thread could ever buy you a moment's reprieve from shame and pain. Those burning, ulcerating aches persist to the point that many noble women cannot sleep soundly. They sit bolt upright at midnight, leaving their velvet armchairs to fumble with a scrap of cloth, yearning for the itch to subside, but all in vain. Some even resort to crushing fresh leaves into poultices, hoping for antibacterial relief, only to find their skin swelling and burning worse. Yet you, as a royal lady, must still smile at your reflection, reapply your makeup to perfection, and conceal infection marks with powder. How many onlookers see bruises from frantic scratching or reddened patches from infection? Only you truly understand that silent agony And this is the clear proof of the saying, the more splendid the luxury, the greater the hidden danger. You step onto the splendid stage of the palace. Yet beneath the layers of brocade, your own flesh endures the worst sanitation disaster imaginable. When those magnificent gowns and glittering crowns only mask brilliance on the outside and cannot hide the misery within, you finally grasp the true cost of ostentation driven to its extremes. If Versailles was the epicenter of European fashion trends, then wigs and extravagant hairstyles were the finishing touch for the royal image. Imagine each lady at the grand ball not only smoothing her real hair, but also wearing an entire mobile architectural creation on her head. An elaborate metal frame curved like a crescent moon, overlaid with braided horsehair and wool yarn. Even stuffed with cotton to add volume, real hair played only a background role, while the support frame system was the soul of the towering hairstyle, allowing shapes from small crowns to models of warships or miniature gardens to be erected atop your head. The styling process began by fixing the metal frame onto the head, then alternating real and false hair, made of horsehair or wool. You would see hours spent securing each strand with ties and silver pins, then coating it all in a thick layer of pomme de beef tallow, meticulously rendered with beeswax to hold the hair firmly in place, so it wouldn't shift, even as you turned or bowed. This pomade made the hair glossy and provided an ideal base for white powder, ensuring an even pale tone. The white powder not only balanced the color but also created a shimmering effect under candlelight, making you radiant like a living wax statue. However, the more beef tallow you used, the more every crevice of hair became a nursery for lice, mites, and mosquitoes. If you ever heard a rustle in your hair frame, it wasn't a breeze, but a swarm of lice crawling out from the remnants of the previous feast. Court ladies carried small, delicate silver lice, combs engraved with intricate pattern stove, discreetly pluck out lice at the dinner table. Each time you slipped your hand into the frame and extracted a few lice without disturbing the hairstyle, you felt both disgusted and like a mobile parasite nest. The summer sun at Versailles was harsher than you imagined. Under the scorching heat, the pomade melted, seeping between real and false hair, mingling with scalp sweat, making the hair mass feel as heavy as stone. You had to blot your hair with a cloth, but the cloth could not absorb all the oil, only making the hair greasier. The constant neck pain and stiff muscles became an essential seasoning. Many ladies borrowed a quill to scrawl a few lines of poetry across their nape, both to hide the red marks left by the frame and to remind themselves that this beauty comes at a price. Aube. Despite knowing the dangers, you understood you could not back down. In the power race at court, those who were less striking were left behind. The higher, heavier, and more elaborately adorned your hair, the more points you scored in the eyes of the king and nobility. You might borrow a frame from a wealthy friend to try a new style, or commission a unique frame carved with bas-reliefs commemorating a court event only. An unparalleled frame could intimidate rivals. You secretly smiled at the thought of a procession of royal guests entering the hall like a parade of mobile architecture amid wafts of perfume and candlelight. But the danger did not come only from parasites. The towering metal hair frame was also tinder for candles and smoky air. You had heard of a lady who, in waving at a candle in greeting, set her pomade-soaked frame alight, bursting into flames. The sight sent the entire court into panic, and wet cloths had to be brought to smother the blazing earlier tragedy. That night, you sat silently amid flickering light, imagining the hair frame flaming up, twisting like infernal tongues in a royal nightmare. There were times when you, exhausted, dragged yourself into the flower garden, removed the frame, and sat on the grass beneath a rosebush, weeping silently from neck pain and relentless itching. You remembered the early days when you willingly sacrificed your real hair in exchange for admiration. But now, even after removing the frame, the tallow still clung to your scalp, and the lice lay in wait to make a comeback. You wondered if it was possible to be alluring without paying the price in health and comfort. Until you stowed the frame away and wiped off the tallow with an alcohol-soaked cloth. You knew this was merely a prelude. Tomorrow, you would don that frame again. Apply more pomade and white powder. Preparing for another ceremony for in this world. Hairstyle was not just fashion, but the supreme language of power. Whoever mastered the style atop their head would have a voice. To a place. As a modern observer, you might be surprised to learn that behind that halo of glory lay an agonizing campaign. From metal frames, slimy beef tallow, heavy horsehair and wool, to the lurking stench and persistent neck pain. But that was exactly how 17th century royal women affirmed their status. The more dazzling, the more laborious, the more suffering endured, the more revered they became. When you looked back at the sparkling hair just beginning to shed its resin, you understand that sometimes the most expensive beauty is also the longest suffering. After months of wearing those mobile architectures atop your head-enduring gleaming tallow and the relentless ache in your neck, you finally realized that the elaborate wig frame was only the beginning of a true sanitation nightmare. Lice, mites, and every kind of parasite have turned your magnificent wig into a fat paradise and perfect refuge. Realizing this, you can't help but wonder how something celebrated as the pinnacle of fashion could become a nest for grotesque creatures. Surprisingly, beneath that glossy layer of pomme de beef tallow, slow were rendered with beeswaxleys, the ideal environment for lice to hide and multiply. Pomade not only holds the hairstyle, but also provides an abundant food source for these bloody-sucking critters. They cling easily to each strand of real and false hair, creep across the frame, and burrow into the coating of white powder. Whenever you turn your head, you might hear the soft scuttling of lice on your scalp, the palace's own chilling background music. At Versailles, a lice infestation was considered normal. A lady who didn't have at least a few lice was deemed lacking in nobility. You've heard that some women changed their wig frames every season, yet lice remained loyal as ever. Some even measured status by lice no lice, meant you hadn't endured hardship to win public favour. There were whispers, a woman without lice is unfit to inherit the crown. You shudder at the notion that being unclean was recognised as a symbol of power. To cope with these uninvited guests, noble women carried special tools called lice-picking tongs, crafted from fine silver, slender and pointed. They were designed to slip deep into the wig frame and pluck out lice without disturbing the style. You often saw ladies sitting quietly at the banquet table, candlelight flickering, slipping a hand into their towering hair, parting the pomade, and extracting tiny lice. They worked swiftly, like master sculptors, so no one would notice this stealth devouring hour. The sight of a lady calmly sipping her wine admired by guests for her poise, while her hand discreetly reached into her hair to pull out a few lice, might seem amusing, but it vividly illustrates a life of filthy luxury. You could hear the faint tick of an unexpected guest fluttering its wings or scuttling across their silver frame. Then the glint of those ornate tongs engraved with intricate motifs would vanish into a lace muff, a precious talisman for promenading the candlelit hall. But it wasn't only lice. Mites found paradise here. 2. Mites crawled across shoulders. Napes even burrowed into the scalp, if you weren't vigilant. They clung to both real and false hair like seasoned travellers, seeking refuge. Many ladies reported that when feeling a mite's bite, they had to ask a maid to scratch for them or use the tongs on specific spots and leave partial relief. The mite's oils blended with pomade and sweat into a sticky mess, making the wig frame feel as stiff as a drawn bow, and candle smoke always threatened to ignite that flammable pomade, sparking numerous small fires in the glittering hall. You've heard of one lady who, in a greeting gesture near a candle, melted pomade drizzle into flame, setting her wig ablaze. Screams rang out as silk gowns blackened. The hall erupted into chaos. Some grabbed wet cloths. Others stomped at the flames. Smoke billowing as jeweled finery flickered in the inferno, transforming a grand ball into a horrific fire symphony. Such small blazes were not uncommon. A maid once recounted extinguishing a fire with rosewater kept in a crystal bottle because no water bucket was at hand. Sometimes, a lady would leap up as her scarf caught the frame aflame, turning the palace into a hellish masquerade. They drowned out the violins with screams and the crackling of flame, even from afar. You shudder to imagine it happening in the midst of a lavish soiree. The scorching Versailles sun only worsened matters. Under the blistering heat, pomade mixed with scalp sweat, weighing the wig down as if it was stone. You've heard of many ladies removing their frames mid-ball, rushing into the garden, draping themselves over benches, scratching uncontrollably, as if possessed. They'd crush leaves or jasmine blooms into a poultice for temporary relief, almost never effective. Each might bite left and itch like a pinprick, banishing any hope of rest. This ordeal persisted until royal physicians recommended a lice toleration policy. They argued that humble acceptance of lice would spare you social stigma if just a few scurried about. The advice sounded bizarre, yet in the court's atmosphere, it became logical. You wonder if there will ever be a day when royal women can sport a clean hairstyle, or if they must forever endure opulence entwined with filth on post-bar nights. You might see ladies gathering in a private chamber, perched on stools, peering into one another's wig frames to inspect cleanliness before bedtime. The soft rasp of tongs echoed in the hush, meant for the last candle's glow. You stand at the door, hearing the rustle of lice hunts, and think to yourself, is that towering frame worth the price? Indeed. Lice, mites, and parasites turned the wig into a magnificent purgatory. Yet in the court's race for fashion and power, no one dared abandon her mobile architecture, for the least conspicuous would be left behind. You, as a modern observer, might smile at the memory of those lavish gowns and towering wigs concealing lives crawling with lice. As you walk away, the faint scuttling of the lice symphony lingers in your ears, a horrifying concerto of style and infection. Following the days spent wearing tallowy-scented wigs, teeming with parasites, you face an even more toxic challenge: the art of aristocratic makeup. Smooth, pale white complexions and deep red lips were not natural gifts, but the result of thick layers of leady-based powder and pure lead lipsticker. Toxic heavy metal combined with fragrances laced with mercury to fix the scent. Each morning's makeup ritual was a ceremony of smothering your face in dangerous chemicals, making you wonder whether such beauty was worth risking your life. You gently press a leady-based powder brush to your skin, blending to achieve the era's signature Wanjingfa pale look, unaware that the fine powder can seep into capillaries, accumulate in the subdermal tissue, and cause chronic lead poisoning. Many a Versailles lady did not realize that beneath the rice flour, fine layers of powder lay a fortune in lead, manifesting as itching, swelling, and even severe ulcerations if left too long. Sometimes you overheard whispers of a secret movement. Only those whose lips remained unchapped and margins unsores were deemed dedicated to proper makeup. Next came the deep crimson lead lipstick, made from lead oxide, which doubled as a classic sensual accessory and a gateway for lead absorption through the lips. Each time you pursed your lips, you inadvertently ingested traces of lead, raising blood lead levels. Lead attacks the nervous system, causing fatigue, headaches, and digestive issues. Yet amid the chandelier-lit balls and raucous court festivities, you dared not forgo your lipstick. Despite knowing the peril, once your cheeks and lips were perfected, you applied a mercury-infused perfume oiler technique for long-lasting fragrance. Petals of roses, jasmine, and orange peels stewed in a vegetable oil base, with mercury added to neutralize body odor and fix the scent. While mercury helped scents linger, it was a heavy metal that penetrated skin and airways. You had heard rumors of a few ladies suffering mercury poisoning, frequent dizziness, fainting, even seizures, but these remained dark secrets no one dared publicize. When night fell and candlelight masked floors, you struggled to maintain that makeup through the entire banquet. A sheen of perfume oil mingled with fine powder flakes drifting onto your silk collar. You could not help scratching the itch, but only brushed it off furtively to avoid smudging your powder lines. Each prickling sensation on your face reminded you that hundreds of toxins were ravaging your delicate skin. When the event finally ended, you were permitted to remove your mask, but washing off lead powder and lipstick was no simple task. You had to massage your face with a vegetable oil olive or almonto, dissolve the powder, then wipe away the residue with a spritz of alcohol vinegar solution to remove stubborn lead fragments. This treatment left your skin taut, cracked, and flaking, vulnerable to infection from the palace's dusty air. After each cleansing, you would slump your shoulders and think, temporarily clean? But the suffering goes on. Oh, that vicious makeup cycle carried myriad health woes: contact dermatitis, bacterial infections, pustules, even tiny subcutaneous abscesses. You heard of a lady hospitalized for an abscess around her mouth. Unable to cleanse months of lead buildup, others developed ichthyosis, their skin peeling in fish scale patches, forcing them to abstain from makeup for weeks while awaiting recovery. Yet in the royal milieu, a makeup break was taboo. You risked losing fashion credibility and court favor. Your respiratory system suffered too. Every spray of the cleansing solution's alcohol stung your nose-each inhalation required a detox breath. Holding your breath or pinching your nose for a moment before exhaling. The mingled scents of alcohol, vinegar, and lead created a suffocating personal atmosphere. Many ladies developed chronic sinusitis and pharyngitis. Summoning court physicians to administer nasal drops or brewing herbal teas to calm throat irritation, you occasionally choked, tears stinging your eyes, yet forced yourself to maintain a regal composure, surrounded by jars of lead powder, lead lipstick, and mercury perfume. You gradually realized you were trapped in a lethal beauty game. The more you painted, the more dependent and damaged you became. Looking in the mirror in your private chamber, you saw dulled skin, dark spots, and pores enlarged to pinhead size-loathing like the praised living wax figures. You swallowed hard, yearning. If only I could turn back time and reclaim my natural simplicity. But history offers no retreat. The next morning, you had to repaint for the next ceremony, for in court, appearance was power. You recognized that the dangerous beautification ritual formed a vicious circle. The more attention you lavished, the more harm you suffered, and the more harm you endured, the more you had to beautify, silently. Your skin bore invisible wounds, a reminder that the cost of perfect appearance could exceed that of gold and jewels. This proves the proverb, the more splendid, the more hidden dangers. You, as a modern observer, might feel pity for the hundreds of ladies who endured this pain merely to preserve fragile beauty. As you depart the Palace of Versailles, images of pale faces and blood-red lips linger in your mind, reminding you that in that world of opulence, peril did not lurk only behind velvet drapesit hid in plain sight on every woman's face. When you step down into the palace kitchens, the backstage of so many lavish banquets, you can't help but be stunned by the suffocating chaos before you. The walls, once tiled in gleaming ceramic, are now old and stained, and the palace's decrepit sewer network functions like a hidden monster, sending sewage gushing back into the room. You wander through billowing cooking smoke, inhale the acrid stench of dirty water, black sludge, excrement, and every manner of filth rising in a pungent cloud. Before you, the once ornate wooden chopping block is coated in a thin layer of mud. silver knives and utensils, dimly lit by a single bulb, are crusted with grime. Pots and cast iron pans swim in scummy residue, clinging to their rims as they bear silent witness to scraps of food drifting in from the drains. You hear the splashing of sewage through clogged floor grates, each icy drop striking the base of the walls and chilling your ankles. Huge black flies lumber across the chopping board. Yellow flies buzz lazily around bowls and plates, freely landing on meat awaiting preparation, then flitting off to hover above the simmering soup. The chef's hands, gloved in leather-use iron ladles, to flick the flies aside and push on, ladling broth into tureens and sending platters of meat back out to the banquet. You shudder at the thought of that very cut of meat being served to a noble on a fine porcelain dish. And it gets worse. After pork or beef is butchered in the courtyard, there is rarely enough ice to preserve it. So a single scorching afternoon darkens the meat and turns it foul. Fish hauled in from the Seine, left for only a few hours in a damp, tarpaulin-walled shed, develops white patches and even blacker-green mold on its shimmering scales. Fruit arranged in baskets on wooden shelves, with no cooling whatsoever, begins to spoil after 2 or 3 days in the humid storeroom. Apples sprout brown spots, pears soften into mush, and white mold creeps across their skins. Yet despite these clear signs of decay, the head chef orders the mold scraped away and the produce cooked anyways. Serving the royal class is the supreme duty and cannot be delayed or refused. You wonder how many state banquets have proceeded under the shadow of food poisoning. In fact, on many occasions, royals and higher-ranking guests ended up in the palace infirmary. Groans and cries echoed through the grand hall as several courtiers clutched their bellies, collapsing into chairs when cramps struck. Embroidered ribbons once pristine now lay rumpled as hosts, doubled over in agony, dashed into the corridor, vomiting onto carriages parked near the gate, forcing outriders to reel at the horrific odour. Acute diarrhea struck like a winter downpour, sending guests fleeing to private chambers, slamming doors behind them to wail and summon physicians. Internal communications recorded that at a grand banquet celebrating King Louis XIV's birthday, dozens of dignitaries were poisoned after eating goose liver pâté. Liver, prone to spoil if salted improperly, was handled amid the squalor, with flies perched on the stilly warm pâté, creating a breeding ground for bacteria. Some ministers tried to keep up appearances, toasting with goblets in hand, but the pale hue of their faces and beads of sweat betrayed the pain within. You recall a visiting queen from a neighbouring realm who was forced to leave mid-dinner, collapsing onto a bench outside the hall. She pressed a handkerchief to her nose, retching repeatedly, until attendants helped her into a carriage, bound for home. Although Versailles prided itself on hospitality, it could not escape the scandal. Rumours spread across Europe, causing many envoys to hesitate before accepting invitations. No one wanted misfortune. In reality, the palace kitchen was not merely a place of meal preparation, but a latent outbreak zone. Flies thronged every surface. Rats lurked beneath tables, even leaping onto chefs' coats to scavenge scraps. The finest hardwood cutting boards could not mask the rank odour. There were no paper towels. Cloths fetched buckets of water but did not wash dishes. The sinks lacked sufficient water pressure to properly cleanse knives and pots, which were merely rinsed off and left to sit until the next day. Some court members, embracing a prideful death philosophy, refused dubious dishes and earned reputations as fussy eaters. But most household stewards bit the bullet to preserve their family's honour. Many later required treatment in the palace infirmary, sipping detox teas made from angelica root, basil leaves, and Policia's bark offering only temporary relief from pain and vomiting. Diarrhea persisted, causing severe dehydration, gaunt faces, and sunken, dark ringed eyes. As an outside observer, you see the stark contradiction. The Palace of Versailles, celebrated for its culinary artistry, and elite status, suffers most from its own terrible sewer system. The filthy state of the kitchens stands as vivid proof that the greatest luxury can become the source of disaster. You understand now that to stage those magnificent feasts, basic hygiene was sacrificed, putting countless lives at risk. From that moment on, you cannot help but wonder, will there ever come a day when the palace kitchens are renovated, the sewer network upgraded, and food safety made a top priority? Or in the court's world, must beauty and glory always be paid for with the health and lives of its servants? After all, the palace kitchens, most profoundly affected by the dreadful sewers, remain a silent sanitation tragedy. Hidden behind red velvet curtains, golden candlelight, and the gentle piano melodies echoing through the royal halls, when you step down into the palace kitchens, the backstage of so many lavish banquets, you can't help but be stunned by the suffocating chaos before you. The walls, once tiled in gleaming ceramic, are now old and stained, and the palace's decrepit sewer network functions like a hidden monster, sending sewage gushing back into the room. You wander through billowing cooking smoke, inhale the acrid stench of dirty water, black sludge, excrement, and every manner of filth rising in a pungent cloud. Before you, the once ornate wooden chopping block is coated in a thin layer of mud, silver knives and utensils, dimly lit by a single bulb, are crusted with grime. Pots and cast-iron pans swim in scummy residue, clinging to their rims as they bear silent witness to scraps of food drifting in from the drains. You hear the splashing of sewage through clogged floor grates, each icy drop striking the base of the walls and chilling your ankles. Huge black flies lumber across the chopping board. Yellow flies buzz lazily around bowls and plates, freely landing on meat awaiting preparation, then flitting off to hover above the simmering soup. The chef's hands gloved in leather-use iron ladles to flick the flies aside and push on, ladling broth into tureens and sending platters of meat back out to the banquet. You shudder at the thought of that very cut of meat being served to a noble on a fine porcelain dish. And it gets worse. After pork or beef is butchered in the courtyard, there is rarely enough ice to preserve it, so a single scorching afternoon darkens the meat and turns it foul. Fish hauled in from the Seine, left for only a few hours in a damp, tarpaulin walled shed, develops white patches and even blacker-green mold on its shimmering scales. Fruit arranged in baskets on wooden shelves, with no cooling whatsoever, begins to spoil after 2 or 3 days in the humid storeroom. Apples sprout brown spots, pears soften into mush, and white mold creeps across their skins. Yet despite these clear signs of decay, the head chef orders the mold scraped away and the produce cooked anyways. Serving the royal class is the supreme duty and cannot be delayed or refused. You wonder how many state banquets have proceeded under the shadow of food poisoning. In fact, on many occasions, royals and higher-ranking guests ended up in the palace infirmary. Groans and cries echoed through the grand hall as several courtiers clutched their bellies, collapsing into chairs when cramps struck. Embroidered ribbons, once pristine now lay rumpled as hosts, doubled over in agony, dashed into the corridor, vomiting onto carriages parked near the gate, forcing outriders to reel at the horrific odour. Acute diarrhea struck like a winter downpour, sending guests fleeing to private chambers, slamming doors behind them to wail and summon physicians. Internal communications recorded that at a grand banquet celebrating King Louis XIV's birthday, dozens of dignitaries were poisoned after eating goose liver pâté. Liver, prone to spoil if salted improperly, was handled amid the squalor, with flies perched on the still warm pâté, creating a breeding ground for bacteria. Some ministers tried to keep up appearances, toasting with goblets in hand, but the pale hue of their faces and beads of sweat betrayed the pain within. You recall a visiting queen from a neighbouring realm who was forced to leave mid-dinner, collapsing onto a bench outside the hall. She pressed a handkerchief to her nose, retching repeatedly, until attendants helped her into a carriage bound for home. Although Versailles prided itself on hospitality, it could not escape the scandal. Rumours spread across Europe, causing many envoys to hesitate before accepting invitations. No one wanted misfortune. In reality, the palace kitchen was not merely a place of meal preparation, but a latent outbreak zone. Flies thronged every surface. Rats lurked beneath tables, even leaping onto chefs' coats to scavenge scraps. The finest hardwood cutting boards could not mask the rank odour. There were no paper towels. Cloths fetched buckets of water, but did not wash dishes. The sinks lacked sufficient water pressure to properly cleanse knives and pots, which were merely rinsed off and left to sit until the next day. Some court members, embracing a prideful death philosophy, refused dubious dishes and earned reputations as fussy eaters. But most household stewards bit the bullet to preserve their family's honour. Many later required treatment in the palace infirmary, sipping detox teas made from angelica root, basil leaves, and Policia's bark offering only temporary relief from pain and vomiting. Diarrhea persisted, causing severe dehydration, gaunt faces, and sunken, dark-ringed eyes. As an outside observer, you see the stark contradiction. The Palace of Versailles, celebrated for its culinary artistry and elite status, suffers most from its own terrible sewer system. The filthy state of the kitchen stands as vivid proof that the greatest luxury can become the source of disaster. You understand now that to stage those magnificent feasts, basic hygiene was sacrificed, putting countless lives at risk. From that moment on, you cannot help but wonder, will there ever come a day when the palace kitchens are renovated, the sewer network upgraded, and food safety made a top priority? Or in the court's world, must beauty and glory always be paid for with the health and lives of its servants? After all, the palace kitchens most profoundly affected by the dreadful sewers remain a silent sanitation tragedy. Hidden behind red velvet curtains, golden candlelight, and the gentle piano melodies echoing through the royal halls, you step through the grand doorway of Versailles' formal reception room once reserved for meetings and elaborate entertainments, and find it transformed into an impromptu infirmary, fatigués nobles. Their faces drained of colour, lie scattered across velvet-upholstered sofas. The sumptuous feasts of days past have given way to the dreary spectacle of people racked by diarrhea and dysentery. You draw in a long breath and are struck by the telltale stench of cholera, the acrid odour of excrement mingled with sweat and damp fabric. What was once a setting of refined elegance is now darkened by stomach cramps, the sloshing of acid reflux, and soft moans of distress. The latest wave of illness burst forth without warning. At first there were only a handful of sporadic diarrhea cases, but within days the disease ran rampant through the palace, and there was no quarantine or modern disinfection by fumigation. Instead, anyone showing abdominal pain was carried into the common reception room where merchants and foreign envoys once gathered and left to writhe beside untouched platters of fruit. Attendant ladies placed extra pillows, soothed sufferers, and exchanged anxious glances, afraid to let any lingering wine fumes or the medicinal chicken's blood mixture mingle with the pervasive odour of sickness. You notice some ladies carefully binding thick silk scarves around their noses, not to preserve their delicate skin or block candle smoke, but to mask the foul stench. The masks of the era were rough canvas squares, dipped in laurel oil or medicinal ash in a futile effort to neutralize the odor. Even so, you feel each stale breath pressing through the fibers, forcing you to gasp and shudder at the sight of exalted personages, forced to don crude cloth simply to avoid contagion. The royal physicians, steeped in medieval theories of vital spirits, carried only simple herbal remedies, dried mint leaves, licorice root, powdered fennel seeds, and sprigs of basil for tea. Their most potent antidiarrheal was boiled chicken's blood. They would boil a whole chicken until the blood ran hot, strain off the liquid, Then give the patient a few spoonsful of the thick, methylojoc-dusting broth. The iron tang of the blood made you recoil. Yet it was the treatment most trusted, for the physicians believed it could hold back the diarrhea. You watch sufferers force themselves to sip the chicken's blood, only to retch violently moments later. The bacteria and parasites remain alive, and the blood does nothing but fill the stomach and trigger nausea. Many patients suffer severe dehydration, cracked lips, sunken eyes, paper or thimpolor. They lie motionless, too weak to speak, only emitting faint groans. Concerned attendants press damp cloths to their foreheads, murmuring, "Stay calm," though anxiety is etched on every face. The epidemic brought the court's bustling life to a standstill. Nocturnal banquets, musical performances, and court operas were postponed indefinitely. You, the observer, sense a hush descend. The carved murals loom silent, and the only movement is that of attendants hurrying a suffering lady into an adjacent chamber at the first sign of stomach pain. No one dares grasp the doorknob for fear of contamination. Every face betrays worry, tinged with the scents of medicinal herbs, dried mint, and iron-scented chicken's blood. In response, the court convened an emergency medical council, scribes recording notes and attendants distributing remedies. But few had any knowledge of germs or sewage management. They dared not fling open windows, fearing chilso the room grew stuffier and the smell more cloying. Many ladies eventually begged to lie out on the colonnade, where a faint breeze whispered. Though the marble benches were so cold, they shuddered upon contact. You wonder if the cracks in the stone floor drain thoughtlessly harbour sewage backflow from the cesspits below. The water used to irrigate the gardens, wash dishes, and brew medicinal teas all came from that same polluted source. Not a drop was filtered through sand or brought to a boil. All daily life drew upon this contamination, for the court was too preoccupied with ceremony and feasting to concern itself with basic sanitation. Some reckless noble, soon informed and arrogant, continued to mingle closely in conversation, ignoring any distance, believing that intimacy enhanced social bonds, unaware that their closeness only spread dysentery and cholera more rapidly. Wave after wave of minor outbreaks gave way to larger ones, gradually sapping their immune fortitude. You witness a once robust maid collapse. After only days of banquet duty, too weak even to clear dishes, internal journals record that one court physician proposed a cooling, detoxifying brew of gold thread, coptis, powdered citrus peel, and chamomile, which only marginally eased the spasms. The diarrhea persisted, hollowing bodies to the skeleton thing. These nobles grew too frail to attend court rituals or petition the king, forced to rely on family members for care. This grim scene, unfolding behind red silk screens, was never publicly documented. But you, as a modern witness, can imagine that horror. Every groan, every bead of cold sweat soaking the plush blankets, every knife-like cramp slicing through the gut proof of the ferocity of gastrointestinal disease in the royal era. When you leave the reception room and pass through the heavy, golden-lit doors, the images of beloved friends bearing the weight of illness cling to your mind. You suddenly understand that, amid opulence, wine-choked festivities, and courtly splendor, a silent dread always lingered. The invisible foes called infection, diarrhea, and dysentery demons that gnawed at health and stole the smiles and dignity of an entire dynasty. When you step through the grand doors of Versailles' sumptuous reception, room once reserved for gatherings and lavish entertainments, you find it converted into an impromptu infirmary, fatigués nobles, their faces ashen. Lies scattered across the velvet-upholstered settees. The splendid banquet has long since passed, replaced by the dismal sight of people writhing with diarrhea and dysentery. You inhale deeply and are hit by the distinctive stench of cholerated briny odour of excrement mingled with sweat and damp fabrics. What once felt like refined elegance is now darkened by stomach cramps, acid burps, and soft moans of suffering. The latest outbreak erupted without warning. At first there were only a few isolated cases of diarrhea, but within days it swept through the palace. With no quarantine or fumigation as you might expect. Instead, anyone showing signs of abdominal pain was carried into the common reception room where merchants and foreign envoys once mingled and left to writhe beside uneaten fruit platters. The ladies in attendance could only add pillows, offer gentle reassurance, and exchange worried glances, afraid to let any lingering wine fumes or the smell of chicken's blood medicine hide the reality of disease. You notice several ladies carefully wrapping thick silk scarves around their noses. The fabric isn't meant to preserve their skin or block candle smoke, but to mask the overpowering stench. The masks of the day were coarse cloth squares steeped in laurel oil or medicinal ash, in a futile attempt to neutralize the odor. Even still, you feel each stifling breath press through the fibers, forcing you to gasp and shiver at the sight of dignified personages forced to don crude masks merely to avoid contagion. The royal physicians, steeped in medieval humoral theory and notions of vital spirits, carried only simple herbal remedies: dried mint leaves, licorice root, fennel seed powder, and sprigs of basil for tea. Their most potent anti-diarrheal was boiled chicken's blood. They would simmer a hen until the blood ran hot, strain off the liquid, and give the patient a few spoonfuls of the iron-tasting concoction. The metallic tang of the chicken's blood made you recoil, yet it was the most trusted treatment. Believed to stem the diarrhea, you watch as sufferers struggle to swallow each spoonful of chicken's blood, only to retch moments later. The pathogens remain, and the blood does nothing but fill the stomach and trigger nausea. Many patients suffer severe dehydration, cracked lips, hollowed eyes. They lie motionless, too weak even to speak, save for faint groans. Attendant ladies frantically press damp cloths to their foreheads, murmuring, "Stay calm," though anxiety is etched on every face. The epidemic swept away the court's vibrant life. Evening banquets, musical salons, and court operas were postponed indefinitely. You, as observer, sense a hush descend. The carved murals loom silent, and the only movement is that of attendants hustling afflicted ladies into adjacent chambers at the first sign of cramps. No one dares touch doorknobs fearful of contagion, and every face bears an expression of worry, tinted with the scents of medicinal herbs, dried mint, and chicken's blood. In response, the court formed an emergency medical council, scribes jotting down notes as attendants distributed remedies. But few had any understanding of microbes or sewage control. They dared not throw open the windows fearing drafts, so the room grew stifling and the odours festered. Many ladies eventually begged to lie on the adjoining colonnade, where a faint breeze whispered, yet the marble benches were so cold they sent shivers through the fevered. You wonder whether the cracks in the stone floor drain are channels for sewage backflow from the cesspits below. The water used for watering plants, washing dishes, and brewing teas all comes from that same contaminated source. Not a drop is filtered through sand or brought to a boil. Every facet of daily life draws upon this pollution, for the court is too busy with ceremony and feasting to concern itself with basic hygiene. Some reckless noble sun-informed and arrogant continued to mingle closely, believing that intimacy would enhance social bonds, unaware that their closeness only hastened the spread of diarrhea and dysentery. Wave after wave of small outbreaks gave way to larger ones, gradually eroding their immune resilience. You watch a once robust maid collapse. After only days of banquet duty, too weak even to clear plates. Internal journals record that one court physician recommended a cooling, detoxifying brew of gold thread, coptis, powdered citrus peel, and chamomile, which only marginally relieved cramps. The diarrhea persisted, hollowing bodies to skeleton thin. These nobles grew too feeble to attend court rituals or petition the king. I forced to rely on family members for care. This grim scene, unfolding behind embroidered silk screens, was never publicly documented, but you, as a modern witness, can imagine that horror. Every groan, every bead of cold sweat, soaking fine linens, every cramp, like a blade twisting in the gut proof of the ferocity of gastrointestinal disease in the royal era. When you leave the reception room and pass through the heavy golden doors, the sight of beloved companions burdened by sickness lingers with you. You suddenly understand that amid opulence, wine-shooked revelry, and courtly splendor, a silent dread always lurked. The invisible foes of infection, diarrhea, and dysentery demons that eroded health and stole the smiles and dignity of an entire dynasty. You step through the opulent reception chamber of Versailles, reserved for gatherings and grand entertainments, and find it now repurposed as an ad hoc sick ward. Tired nobles, their faces drawn, lie scattered across velvet-upholstered couches. The sumptuous feast is long over, replaced by the grim sight of people racked with diarrhea and dysentery. You inhale deeply, catching the unmistakable stench of cholerae, brackish odor of excrement mingled with sweat and damp fabrics. The air, once scented with refined elegance, is now heavy with stomach cramps, acid belches, and soft groans of pain. The latest outbreak erupted without warning. At first, there were only a handful of diarrhea cases, but within days, it swept through the palace. There was no quarantine or fumigation as you might expect. Instead, anyone showing signs of abdominal distress was carried into the communal reception room where merchants and foreign envoys had once mingled and left to writhe beside unswept fruit platters. Attendant ladies, powerless, could only add pillows and offer reassurance, exchanging anxious glances as they stood amid leftover wine fumes, medicinal chicken's blood, and the pervasive odor of sickness. You notice several ladies cautiously wrapping thick silk scarves around their noses, not for skincare or to block candle smoke, but to mask the overpowering stench. The masks of the era were coarse cloth squares steeped in laurel oil or medicinal ash in a futile effort to neutralize the smell. Even so, you feel stale breaths pressing through the fibers, forcing you to gasp and shudder at the sight of high-born personages forced into makeshift face coverings simply to avoid contagion. The court physicians, steeped in medieval theories of humours and vital spirits, carried only simple herbal remedies: dried mint leaves, licorice root, fennel seed powder, and sprigs of basil for tea. Their most potent anti-diarrheal was boiled chicken's blood. They simmered a fowl until the blood ran hot, then strained off the liquid and gave a few spoonfuls to the patient. The metallic tang made you recoil, yet it was the most trusted treatment, believed to stem the diarrhea. You watch sufferers try to swallow spoonful after spoonful of chicken's blood, only to retch moments later. The pathogens remain unharmed, and the blood merely fills the stomach and triggers more nausea. Many patients suffer severe dehydration, cracked lips, sunken eyes, or paperworthin pallor. They lie motionless, too weak to speak, save for faint groans. Attendants press damp cloths to their foreheads, murmuring, "Stay calm," though worry is etched on every face. The epidemic swept away the court's vibrant life. Banquets, musical evenings, and court operas were indefinitely postponed. You, as observer, sense the hush that falls. Grand carved murals stand silent, and the only movement is attendants hustling afflicted ladies into adjacent chambers at the first groan of pain. No one dares touch doorknobs, fearful of contamination, and every face bears an expression of concern, tinted with the scents of medicinal herbs, dried mint, and a lingering iron tang. In response, the court formed an emergency medical council. Scribes recording notes as attendants distributed remedies. But few had any knowledge of germs or sewage management. They dared not throw open windows fearing drafts, so the room grew stifling and the odours festered. Many ladies eventually begged to lie on the adjacent colonnade, where a faint breeze whispered, though the cold marble benches sent shivers through their fevered bodies. You wonder whether the cracks in the floor drains serve as channels for sewage backflow from the cesspits below. The water used to irrigate the gardens, wash dishes, and brew medicinal teas all comes from that same contaminated source. Not a drop is filtered through sand or brought to a boil. Every aspect of daily life draws upon this pollution, for the court is too busy with ceremony and feasting to concern itself with basic hygiene. Some reckless noble son informed and arrogant continued to mingle closely, believing that intimacy would enhance social bonds, unaware that their closeness only spread diarrhea and dysentery more rapidly. Wave after wave of minor outbreaks gave way to larger ones, gradually wearing down their immune resilience. You witness a robust maid collapse. After only days of banquet duty, too weak even to clear dishes, internal records note that one court physician recommended a cooling, detoxifying brew of gold thread, citrus peel powder, and chamomile, which only slightly eased the spasms. The diarrhea persisted, hollowing bodies to skeleton thin. These nobles became too feeble to attend court rituals or petition the king, forced to rely on family members to care for them. This grim scene, unfolding behind crimson silk screens, was never publicly documented, but you, as a modern observer, can imagine that horror. Every groan, every bead of cold sweat soaking fine linens, every cramp, like a blade twisting in the guttural proof of the ferocity of gastrointestinal disease in the royal era. When you leave the reception chamber and pass through the heavy gilded doors, the images of beloved companions ravaged by illness cling to your mind. You realize that amid opulence, wine-choked revelry, and courtly splendor, a silent dread always lurked, the invisible foes of infection, diarrhea, and dysentery demons that gnawed away at health and stole the smiles and dignity of an entire dynasty. Immediately after the agonizing hours of childbirth, you might think you'd have time to rest and recover, but at the Versailles court, everything is pared down to the bare minimum. Postnatal monitoring of the mother is practically instantaneous. The physicians and court doctors focus solely on recording the newborn's sex prince or princess, and scribble a hurried note about the mother's condition as healthy or weak. Every other crucial detail, blood loss volume, body temperature, pain level, whether the sutures are infected, goes unrecorded. You wonder whether those medical ledgers are ever opened again to guide any careful recovery measures. There is no long-term care program, no foundational rehabilitation exercises, or special nutritional regimen. The books are slammed shut after the two words, healthy, and you are immediately escorted to the reception chamber. Even though your incision still bleeds and your flesh burns with pain, you must don a tight silk gown trimmed with stiff buttons, slip on a goldy embroidered overcoat, and cram your feet into the high-heeled shoes that already pinch. The glittering splendor of the reception brooks no moment of weakness, and lookers expect to see only the dignified poise of a royal lady freshly recovered. The ballroom is already aglow with candlelight and strings poised to play. Awaiting foreign dignitaries and high ministers, you, whose body has just survived the brink of death, are forced to smile, lift a glass of celebratory wine, and respond to every toast. Each step onto the dais sends a jolt of pain through your spine whenever the gown's waistband tightens around your hips. You must force a graceful smile through the social embraces, while tears leak silently down your back out of sight of the courtiers. The consequence of returning immediately after birth is infected incisions. New skin that needs time to knit together is instead repeatedly rubbed by jewelry, buttons, and silk drapery. Green-yellow pus seeps beneath the gown's hem you must stifle your breathing. Lift your skirt discreetly to dab at it with a damp cotton cloth. Each time you do, the wound reopens, swells more severely, and hallway dust and perspiration quickly infiltrate, allowing staphylococcal bacteria to ignite a spreading cellulitis. Not only localized infection, but you also suffer aches throughout your body. Your immunity, already depleted by blood loss and stress, collapses further under neglectful aftercare. You begin to run a mild fever, shiver with chills, and feel too groggy to fulfill any ceremony. Yet stepping back would brand you weak or spineless, an unforgivable offense in a court that places valor and authority above all. Sometimes a court physician drifts by your chamber for just minutes, placing a hand on your brow, sighing, and jotting weak in the ledger. They prescribe no antibiotics, still unknown, but dispense a few pills of herbal powder to mix with warm water. When you complain of pain, they look at you as though you've outlived your usefulness and smile. Postpartum women must endure. You know in your heart that you stand alone in this battle. While the crown and title you once wore with pride have become shackles, day after day. The incision continues to drain. You hide it under an extra layer of cotton petticoats, fearing the discharge will stain your gowns. Though your health is far from restored, you must resume letter writing, host diplomatic receptions, and seal new edicts. Sweat mixed with wound fluid and ivory powder makeup clings to your skin, etching the future scar ever more deeply. You understand that even when the external wound finally closes, your mental and physical well-being will bear the lifelong consequences. Many noble women in your position later rely on canes to hobble about, their joints aching for the rest of their days. They must call on children or attendants to bathe them and attend their sutures, unable to bend, to tie their shoes or slip them on. Countless women turn to quack practitioners outside the court, paying dearly for miracle remedies that often worsen their condition. You, as an outsider's witness, feel sorrow thinking of those hasty medical records that note only healthy or weak, and never capture the depth of suffering or its long-term effects. The books record no date for final suture closure, nor follow-up appointments. No regimen of physical therapy or dietary support. Everything is eclipsed by glory and ceremony. At last, you wonder if there will ever come a day when the court acknowledges that investing in genuine postpartum care, from medical monitoring and wound rehabilitation to special nutrition, could help royal ladies lead healthier lives, sparing them lifelong scars and pain. Or will the court forever treat postpartum recovery as a short-term duty, continuing to favor outward splendor at the expense of women's real health and happiness? As you step out of the palace, the image of noble women leaning on canes, silently bearing their pain behind the resplendent rails, will haunt you always. In summary, behind the glittering splendor of the 17th century Palace of Versailles lies a horrifying portrait of sanitation and disease. From the outside, the royal ladies appear as the epitome of beauty: lavish velvet gowns, giant wigs, thick layers of makeup, and intoxicating perfumes. Yet beneath that fragile veneer lay the stench of rot, lice hidden in the radiant hair, parasitic worms wriggling within, and tormenting bouts of diarrhea. They witnessed polite society disrupted by sneezes from lead dust, wine-soaked banquets interspersed with the moans of the sick. A dreadful sewer system sent sewage surging back into the kitchens, with swarms of flies alighting on the food. Lice-picking tongs and tattered suturing needles became indispensable treasures, while obstetric instruments never saw boiling water for sterilization. With no fixed toilets, chamber pots perpetually overflowed outside windows and along corridors, and the graceful steps of noble women forced to lift their skirts could not escape the stench or infection risk. Each step was not only a graceful curve, but also an effort to avoid puddles of human waste and bacteria clinging everywhere. Childbirth at court was even more tragic. The birthing chamber was cramped like a theatre of horrors for a throng of onlookers, Surgical tools were unsterilized. A single cold knife lacerated the perineum, and the doctor's blood-soaked hands then clumsily stitched it up. Postpartum care was non-existent. Medical records offered only the terse words healthy or weak, while the mother had to force herself to rise, don a tight dress, and slip into high heels, even though her wound still oozed. All these efforts to perform power and elegance turned the royal circle into victims of their own splendor. Every basic hygiene, need regular bathing, hand washing, post-toilet cleanliness was cast aside in favor of ceremony and image. There were virtually no quarantine measures or disinfection fumigations, and intestines were under siege by diarrhea, dysentery, parasitic worms, and postpartum fever, with ruthless bloodletting boiled chicken's blood to endure the pain. They sacrificed their health, even their lives, to preserve the regal dignity of the court. External scars eventually closed, but the physical and emotional wounds endured for life. Joint pain, limping with canes, cellulitis, intestinal infections, exhaustion from dehydration, even death from puerperal fever. That majestic Versailles held not only crowns and silk, but also a series of silent sanitation tragedies. If we look back, we will understand that sometimes the more dazzling the crown, the more unspeakably filthy the backstage becomes. It was the most terrifying sanitation nightmare in royal history, where status and power forced people to forsake the most basic values of life: cleanliness, safety, and mutual care. And now, having heard the tale of those hidden tragedies at Versailles, relax and let your mind settle after those chilling images. Imagine the cool Parisian night, the chime of distant clock towers, and the stars sparkling overhead, banishing the stench and painful memories, wishing you a good night's sleep, dreaming, peaceful dreams, free of foul odors or painful cries. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our newest and best videos. See you on our next journey into mysterious history.